Welcome everyone to the first event in our 2020-2021 program on environmental feminisms. And this is our opening roundtable. We are very excited to be able to host this event. My name is Kathy Brown, and I am the outgoing director of GSWS and the Alice Paul Center. The reason I'm still hanging around is simple. The people and the stimulating collegial intellectual environment that we have created, working with the GSWS staff, Gwendolyn Beetham, Maria Murphy, Shauna Behemoth, Ricardo Bracho, Jonathan Katz, Roz Lee, has been my great joy and privilege over the past several years. I urge you to get involved with the center and its programming, and also with our pedagogical mission at GSWS. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the current director of GSWS and APC. He has been a scholar in residence with the Alice Paul Center. He is currently also the professor of practice in art history, Jonathan Katz.
Thank you, Kathy. And again, welcome everybody. I hope you'll come to see that there's a burgeoning level of activity associated with GSWS. One that we intend to very much keep going in the future. And I wanted to give you a taste of that with a brief of upcoming events. So on September 30th, if you have any concerns about the election, and who doesn't, we are having an election event with Anthea Butler and Dawn Teal at 6 p.m. Again, everything will be online. On October 2nd, we will begin our first of the Works in Progress series. This will be at noon on Friday, October 2nd, and we are featuring actually our incoming visiting faculty member, Jorge Sanchez Cruz, whose talk is called Debility, Negative Affect, Mobility, Undocuqueer Aesthetics, and the Right to Thrive. On October 8th is a very special event from 5 to 7. And that is a conceptual Black spectacle on COVID and the protests and the interwoven legacies of race and gender and sexuality and Black queer artistic insurgency. It's been supported by the Sachs Center, so we thank them for that. And that will be with Ariane Wilkerson and our own Ricardo Bracho. And then on October 29th, Fariha Roisin will be giving a lunchtime workshop from 12 to 1:30 and a reading from 4 to 5. And on November 6th, the second of our Works in Progress series, with our own Pilar Gonzalez Pons, speaking on servants of production, politics of domestic workers' labor rights, part of our big theme for this year, on care work. Then on November 12th, I'll be giving a lecture at 6 o'clock, which will be on an exhibition I curated that took place in Chicago on art and transness. So there'll be a lot of discussion about trans art. And then finally, on December 4th, one of our next works in progress are Sophie Lewis talking on notes on bioconservative feminism, femnationalism, white slaves, and adult human female. Again, those all of our works in progress are the first Fridays of the month, and they're always at noon. We welcome you to everything and hope we see you again. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kathy and Jonathan. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Maria, and I'm the Interim Associate Director of the Alice Paul Center here at Penn. In addition to our presenters today, who I'll be introducing shortly, I am joined by Shauna, our GSWS APC Program Coordinator, who will also be running the stream with me today. And I would like to begin our event with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement, for anyone who may not be familiar with the practice, often takes place at the beginning of lectures, ceremonies, and public events such as this opening roundtable. To acknowledge is one small way to show respect to Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and its histories. In an effort to recognize both the historical and ongoing practices of colonization, we wish to affirm that the Alice Paul Center and Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pennsylvania occupies the traditional unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape people. We wish to acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together in this community that, while virtual today, is based out of Philadelphia. Our year at the center, dedicated to environmental feminisms, is part of an ongoing effort to recognize our own individual and institutional place in settler colonialism, and to better understand the relationship between Indigenous knowledges and climate activism by engaging these ideas alongside other environmental feminist work more broadly throughout the year. Thank you. I am thrilled to have our 6 roundtable presenters here today whose work in various ways helps us to reimagine our interactions with and understanding of what counts as the environment across a wide range of feminist methods, tactics, and disciplinary contexts. Each panelist will present for just under 10 minutes, then we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion. I want to encourage our viewers on YouTube and Facebook to post your comments and questions throughout the presentations, and if the tech cooperates, we should be able to see them and incorporate them into our discussion after the presentations. I'd also like to ask you for your patience for any technical glitches that might come up as we navigate this new virtual space of programming. Okay, on to our first presenter, Bethany Wiggin. Bethany Wiggin is the founding director of the Penn program in Environmental Humanities and associate professor of German here at Penn. Currently working on Utopia Found and Lost in Penn's Wood, a book about settler colonialism and the ending of worlds in the Anthropocene, she is the author and editor of Timescales, Thinking Across Ecological Temporalities, Babel of the Atlantic, The Rise and Fall, or Fall and Rise of Monolingualism, Untranslatables, New Maps for Germanic Literatures, and Novel Translations, the German novel and the European book. Working with students at Penn, she founded the Penn program in Environmental Humanities, an interdisciplinary academic program committed to public engagement and place-based collaborative research. She's been a Whiting Public Engagement Fellow and is the recipient of a Science Defender Award from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Today, she will present Learning with Forgotten Places.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that generous introduction, and thanks to everyone really in the GSWS community, and especially to you, Maria, and the Alice Paul Center, not least of which for navigating the technical difficulties with the slides. If you want to go ahead and just bring those up, I will do my very best to remember to tell you when to advance them. And viewers and listeners, please bear with me as we grapple with this technology, which, despite its glitches, provides the welcome opportunity to be with you today. So just there's the slide. Perfect. So environmental humanities reside at the confluence of critique and action, of theory and practice. And like other environmental humanities initiatives around the globe, at the Penn program in Environmental Humanities, we aim to foster diverse communities of knowledge and action in project-based activities. In line with our self-understanding at PPEH as a feminist co-laboratory, we call these projects experiments in environmental feminism. Next slide, please. These experiments are infused with intersectional feminist thought throughout, and of course, I cannot give adequate time to all the feminist activist scholars whose work infuses the project that I've been developing at PPEH, as well as other faculty and students. But I want to acknowledge my own debt to Bell Hooks, and particularly her book, Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope. Over 2 decades of teaching and learning in more and less formal educational settings, first in literature classrooms and over the last 5 years in the environmental humanities, it's been a touchstone text. Hope, the Hooksian kind of hope, without illusion, canny, and steely, hope suffuses these experiments to such an extent that unless I named it, you might not see it. I'm going to use my allocated minutes to share some of the conceptual as well as the geographical and historical bases for these hope-filled experiments that I've been so privileged to co-develop. That means specifically, I'm going to talk kind of fast about the multi-species worlds and shifting waterscapes, particularly of South Philadelphia's former marshlands, which used to be as much water as land. And I'm going to read these remarks in an attempt to stay on time. I'm really looking forward to conversing more informally with you after this round of prepared remarks. Next slide, please. On a damp May day, months before COVID-19 began its leap across the species divide, participants in a conference I designed and hosted in person, Teaching and Learning with Rising Waters, left Penn's campus to get some exercise. We were led by the New York-based Experimental Arts Collective, the other EPA, that is the Environmental Performance Agency, and we took a short walk along the Schuylkill River, one of the two rivers between which William Penn cited colonial Philadelphia. The 7-mile tidal stretch of the Schuylkill River flows and increasingly often overflows its hardened embankments. They're filled with riprap, put into place in the 19th century to hold up heavy industry on soggy ground. The artist led us under rail and auto bridges along the edges of the river, along high fences and out onto piers. In movements scored for stops along the way, the artist asked us to breathe deeply and evaluate the smells, to hold hands, to count projected sea level rise in handholds up towers holding utility lines, to get on our bellies on a pier over water and wiggle like fish, to walk backwards up a path moving into the future, and to consider more generally what exercises for our bodies and our brains we might need to build muscle, by which I mean the sensory faculties, intellectual and emotional capacities, and political will to develop the representational tools and concepts, and then the instruments needed to take measure of this changing anthropogenic landscape so as to represent it and then respond to it. Next slide, please. For centuries, the Schuylkill and the Delaware rivers have provided a laboratory for human experiments ranging from land reclamation to energy transitions. This unwitting lab, a cradle of global petromodernity, has also offered PPEH faculty, students, and community partners a common site to escape, to follow un- or anti- and transdisciplinary modes of thinking. It is a site that enables us to escape the time space of the university and to engage, as I am exploring in a forthcoming article co-authored with PPEH alumni Martin Promoli and Luna Sarti, to explore questions of social and environmental injustices in a place deeply marked by living legacies of racialized colonial and then colonialist powers and practices. Next slide, please. This place is one of many contemporary places ecologists sometimes describe as a patchy environment or a novel ecosystem, terminology which explicitly aims to revalue places otherwise considered degraded or trash. It could also be considered a techno-ecosystem. Slide, please. In the wake of the terrifying refinery explosion in June 2019 that provided a so-called close call for Philadelphia, a city of 1.6 million human residents, I have sometimes called it a blasted landscape. Slide, please. But yet, when working in community and with partners, including Mrs. Tammy Reeves, who you see here, I see how this term, blasted landscapes, is hard for residents to hear and to bear, especially the school children who we have been working with. Perhaps this place is best described with J.T. Rohn and Justin Hosby's term as a place of Black ecologies. I understand the term to be next of relation to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Forgotten Places. As a naming of the outside and the bottom, Black ecologies are foremost sites of ongoing injury, gratuitous harm, and premature death, as Hosby and Rohn write. But I want to emphasize they are not only linked to death, they are also linked to hope. For Black ecologies also figure sites wherein ordinary Black people articulate alternative maps, dissonant and heterodox ecological grammars, as well as visions for a different order. They are places where people have envisioned and are generating tools for different orders. These tools and visions exceed received fields of academic research, and they are vital to be with, to think with, and to learn with, both in and outside the academy. In shifting my own location from the familiar customs, comforts, and logics of power of the university classroom to the riverbanks of South Philadelphia, I've aimed to welcome perspectives marginalized by received academic ways of knowing, whether in the arts or in the sciences. I've become aware, sometimes painfully so, that whatever one said was going to be systematically received in radically heterogeneous ways that we've been neither able nor entitled to prescribe. As active participants in these learning experiments, Luna, Martin, and I have had to develop adequate mentoring strategies and techniques. We labored to articulate our modes of mentoring to students in the one traditional class we've taught at Penn and on the water. We compared our learning community to the hierarchy of a pirate ship as described by Peter Linnebaugh and Marcus Rediker in The Many-Headed Hydra. The figure and the history of the radical Black Atlantic helped us to make sense of our own topsy-turvy classrooms and helped to foster learning practices that account for the larger histories of place and space within which we're situated, and to develop practices of communal mentorship and caring. We've developed 6 learning practices, but as I'm finishing up now, I will discuss only the final one with you. It is recirculating. Despite our hope in teaching and learning in community, we've become keenly aware of the pressures to produce traditional academic outcomes, including panels like this one today, and how they can often sap energy from learning in community. Even those digital humanities and public archiving projects, so often hailed for their radical democratic potential, have grave limits. We learned this lesson time and again in the creation of a public open access, open source river archive. Slide, please. Many members of our learning communities do not have adequate tools. Oh, it's not there. Sorry. For some reason, the last slide has been cut off, but you can visit it at skooklecore.org. Many of our members of our learning community do not have adequate tools or access to make this a meaningful resource. To counteract the very real possibility that projects intended to co-create and share knowledge simply become further examples of extractive practices, we aim to recirculate and to add to archival materials with community engagements. These have included in-person tours, like you saw in the slide previously, and oral, as well as an oral history jukebox that plays in the neighborhood where contributors live, environmental science fiction writing workshops, and installations of speculative art projects for ecotopian futures of the Schuylkill River. Working in community to recirculate and to co-create knowledge, we engage in the speculative practice that is true study, that form of inquiry which environmental feminisms aim to legitimate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Okay, now we will turn to Maris Jones, who is a third-year PhD student in Anthropology and Africana Studies. Her work explores climate change adaptation and survival tactics of Black and Indigenous communities in Bulbancha, New Orleans, Louisiana, Borican, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. The title of her presentation is Notes on Environmental Feminisms, or The Plot of Her Rebuilding. Thank you, Maris. And I just want to say, I think your audio might be off. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Back in February, just before the coronavirus pandemic hit and had really taken off in the US, I attended an event at the Kelly Writers House at Penn. There, after reading a few excerpts from her more well-known works, Dr. Saidiya Hartman read aloud one of her more recent pieces entitled The Plot of Her Undoing. It was published in a series called Notes on Feminisms, and I'm sure, as you can tell now, that is where the title of this talk comes from. And when I was invited to give this talk, I was brought back to that moment in the room at Kelly Writers House where I first heard this text, the moment when I read the words on the page for myself. There was a fierce truth of her words that cut me in a brutally honest way, even more so than when I had just heard them being repeated by her over and over as she read them. Hartman writes, "The plot of her undoing begins with the foreclosure, with the water crisis, with state executions, with derivatives and deregulation, with data mining. It begins with the oil and the pipeline. It begins with silver and gold and diamonds, with fossil fuels and fracking. It begins when the hurricane lands, when the troops arrive at the border. It begins with the wall, with the prison, with the refugee camp. The her in this piece resonated with me deeply, and this is only just like a very small portion of that piece that she wrote. But it resonated because my body in the present lives, breathes, and walks through the legacies of all those who have come before me. And they are histories that are interconnected. And that's one of the things that I really took away from this Idea Hartman piece, that we can't think about fossil fuels and fracking without thinking about the water crisis, without thinking about prisons in the US, without thinking about people who are dying at borders. So I understand environmental histories in this way to be fundamentally interlinked with economic, social, and racial histories, particularly in the US. So much so that often those who are marginalized economically, socially, racially, and politically often bear the disproportionate brunt of environmental hazards and that are the most vulnerable to climate change. We are the front line, the ones sent to die first. With these historical realities in mind, I wanted to reflect on how the things that were my undoing were also unavoidably part of my personal growth and the things that I required to constantly work on to rebuild myself and my community. So I'm gonna pause here to do just that. The plot of her rebuilding begins with utter destruction, a catastrophe. It begins with the sound of bombs as levees collapse. It begins with the death of my brother and the birth of my cousin. The plot of her rebuilding begins when she guts the remains of her childhood home and the founding of the Jones Construction Company. The plot of her rebuilding begins with voluntary transatlantic journeys and new friends from different countries. It begins when she refuses to be an animal in a petting zoo, when she protects her hair from wandering white hands. It begins when she defends and lays claim to her own body for the first time by cutting off her hair. It begins when she sets boundaries. The plot of her rebuilding begins when she lovingly attends to her roots. The plot of her rebuilding begins with connecting to self through diaspora and bound histories. It begins with drumming and the orishas. It begins when she learns to listen. This is what brought me to pursue a PhD in anthropology and Africana studies. Listening. Listening has helped me think about the ongoing impacts and aftermaths of trauma, of storms like Hurricane Katrina, which personally impacted me and my family, along with all of the other storms that have impacted my family along the Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean over generations. Broadly, my research, as Maria mentioned, explores climate change vulnerability and adaptation in Afro-Indigenous, coastal, and island communities governed by the United States. Because of the legacies of enslavement, settler colonialism, and genocidal practices at the hands of the state, communities of African and Indigenous descent are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I am particularly vulnerable. So ultimately, my project is about understanding myself and the communities I come from and stand with. It is a creative process of invoking generational knowledge and survival practices passed down from my kin to endure and survive anti-Blackness, the erasure and suppression of indigeneity, and the annual threat of hurricanes in the Caribbean and along the Gulf Coast. What I do in my work is take what is important to me and approach it through a scholarly lens. At the end of the day, the best advice that I got going into graduate school is that don't sign up to do something that you aren't truly deeply invested in. And Black futures, Indigenous futures are just that for me. And that means that I'm envisioning a future for myself and the people that I come from. If we're thinking about environmental feminisms, just like regular feminism, it needs to be intersectional. We can't just think about this in terms of, well, what are the ways in which climate change and environmental hazards are impacting women? It's never just women. It is all of us. I'm not just a woman. I am a woman who is from the South, who is Black, who is the child of an immigrant, who is the child of an elder, who is a child who lives in history, and this moment in particular is the happening of history. So what does it mean to be doing research about peoples who have been continually marginalized, who are the most vulnerable to climate change and storms that I study. What does it mean to really think through those things and want to do ethical research at a time where those people are also the most vulnerable to coronavirus? So with that, I just want to take this moment to say, as researchers, as folks who are in the academic community, we have a responsibility to truly think about not only the impacts of our research in the present, but on the communities that we are working with. And for me right now, the most ethical thing to do is to return home, to really turn inward and think about the ways in which how I impact the world and the environment around me really plays out. And I don't want to be an unethical researcher. So it's constantly about retooling and finding new ways to go about doing research. And sometimes that means doing things people might not otherwise consider worthy of study or as rigorous. However, it is those avenues of creativity, those methods and modes of survival that folks in our communities have already been navigating with that will allow folks like me to continue and surviving in graduate school. So thank you very much.
Maria, you're muted. You might want to mute yourself. Sorry, everyone.
Excellent. Great. Okay. From the top. Next up, we have Jaskiran Dhillon, Associate Professor of Global Studies and Anthropology at the New School. Jaskiran Dhillon is an anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Her work has been published in The Guardian, Cultural Anthropology, Truth Out, Public Seminar, Feminist Formations, Environment and Society, Social Texts, and Decolonization, among other venues. She is the author of Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and the Politics of Intervention from 2017, and co-editor of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the #NoDAPL Dakota Access Pipeline Movement from 2019. Today, she will share the talk Indigenous Feminism and the Politics of Environmental Justice. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Maria and her co-organizers at the Alice Paul Center for inviting me to be here today and to extend gratitude to my fellow panelists for their insightful commentary about this very important topic. It's an honor to be able to be here to share some thoughts at this opening roundtable, and a warm hello to everyone that's watching. Thanks so much for joining us. So in the time I have to speak to you today, I wanted to share a few thoughts about the importance of Indigenous feminism in helping us think through the problematics and possibilities of environmental politics. One of my first encounters with Indigenous feminism within the context of environmental politics came close to a decade ago when I participated in the Tar Sands Healing Walk, an Indigenous gathering focused on healing the environment and giving voice to the people whose lives are affected by the Tar Sands Industrial Development Project located in northern Alberta, Canada, close to the city of Fort McMurray. The area where the tar sands exists is about as large as the state of As the state of Florida and a number of First Nations territories live in that area and in that region, and there's been devastating impacts on them and their communities. I knew the tar sands existed, but I had a desire to see firsthand where this massive resource extraction project was taking place, and to bring experiential insight to the urgent words of Indigenous environmental feminists who were indicting the central role of the colonial state in sanctioning and benefiting from this devastation. And I just want to read a quick excerpt that I had written shortly after being there that gives you a sense of what it's like on the ground. Kilometers of barren landscape stripped entirely of boreal forest lay before me, the unearthing of the natural world in all four sacred directions. Boundless piles of gray-looking silt replaced a multiplicity of trees, plants, and wildlife that previously made up the Athabasca River region's diverse ecosystem. The hazy sky grew increasingly colorless with the byproducts of extraction billowing from tall towers, the putrid air thick with the smell of rapid-fire development and economic profit. In the background, cannons echoed periodically through the contaminated air, reminiscent of a war zone. The aim? Deterring birds from landing in one of the many toxic tailing pits where millions of liters of water, too polluted to be reused, stand still in time. Disoriented by the severe transformation of these surroundings, I had to keep reminding myself where I was. The topography itself offered little to pinpoint my location. It looked more like a post-apocalyptic scene out of a science fiction novel than the prairies of central Canada. As we ambled along the road heavily trafficked with trucks and buses, we were guided by Dene and Cree elders who performed cultural ceremonies, prayed, and gave offerings back to the earth while drummers sang traditional songs. People spoke repeatedly of treaty violations over land, loss of culture and dignity, and high incidences of suicide for Indigenous youth. Indigenous writer and feminist activist Winona LaDuke reminded us of our own complicity in the mad rush for oil when at one point over the weekend she remarked, quote, "We got to be these people that consume 1/3 of the world's resources, and that requires pretty much constant intervention in other people's territories, whether they are Dene, Anishinaabe, Cree, or whether they are in Venezuela or Africa. It requires a constant violation of people's human rights," end quote. So my participation in this event allowed me to see how environmental destruction and to understand it as a slow industrial genocide and an intensification of the colonial project that dates back to the colonial founding of the United States and Canada. The deeper I dove into this work, both in terms of research and writing and engaging with frontline water and land defense movements, it became more clear that Indigenous feminists and their allies in various forms of interdisciplinary studies, including Black studies and critical ethnic studies and some in environmental studies, were offering a crucial corrective on the homogenizing discourses around the Anthropocene that critically interrogated the expansion and reproduction of capitalism, but often left a critique of colonialism largely out of the picture. So speaking from my own political and Indigenous feminism, and I'm thinking here about the work of Melina Lubicon-Massimo, Ariel Deranger, Melanie Yazzie, Joanne Barker, Audra Simpson, Sandy Grande, and many, many others, has sharpened my thinking around the colonial inheritances that are present in the dominant environmental movement. In particular, they provide the following political and conceptual frameworks for my work. One, I understand that environmental movements must also be anti-colonial movements that foreground a clear understanding of the relationship among colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. Land dispossession and related forms of colonial violence are a fundamental part of the story of environmental injustice and climate change. Winona LaDuke, for example, offers critical insights into notions of interdependence by mapping how colonialism and capitalism destroys the way that a place can sustain life and disrupt processes of co-evolution amongst Indigenous peoples, ecosystems, and other than human relatives that are thousands of years old. Following directly from this point, Indigenous feminism has also made it evidently clear that questions of environmental justice cannot be separated from questions of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. In other words, Indigenous political governance and land reclamation must be central to our strategies of resistance. Next, ending colonial gender violence, as I've learned from Indigenous feminists, is key to environmental justice. While violence against women is often sidelined within environmental discussions, Indigenous feminists reveal that these forms of violence work in tandem with one another, focusing on colonial gender homelands, gender violence, and extractive processes that accompany capitalist colonialism. Simpson writes, quote, "When you use gender violence to remove Indigenous peoples and their descendants from the land, you remove agency from the plant and animal worlds, and you reposition Aki, Anishinaabe for the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people." And finally, Indigenous feminists have offered us an important window into alternative ways of building relations, a guidepost for beginning to conceptualize and embody decolonization centered on the restoration of our planet and the ways that we connect to one another as human beings. And this also reminds us of the importance of keeping our history in the present and carrying it forward into the future as we think about the generations that come after us. Thanks.
Maria, you're muted.
Excellent. Just here to keep things fresh. Okay. Our next presenter is Sophie Lewis, who is a visiting scholar at the Alice Paul Center this year, and she is also faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Dr. Sophie Lewis at Repro Utopia is an independent scholar based in Philadelphia, an essayist, translator, and the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, published with Verso in 2019. She is a member of the Out of the Woods Writing Collective, author of Hope Against Hope, Writings on Ecological Crisis from Common Notions in 2020. And you can sign up for her courses on political theory at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and follow her work at Repro Utopia on social media and her Patreon. The title of her talk today is Gender as Ecocatastrophe. Thank you so much, Sophie. Sophie, I think you are also muted. That seems to be the theme.
I'm so sorry.
Quite all right. We should be good now. Thank
you so much, Maria, and thank you so much, Shana and Jonathan and Kathy and everybody and my fellow panelists for letting me sit among such ecological, decolonial, feminist luminaries on this panel. As Maria said, my name is Sophie. I'm newly a visiting scholar at the APC here at Penn, and amongst those other things, I'm also a member of the Out of the Woods Ecological Writing Collective, a collective that has lately published a book which I keep thinking as I spot it lying around my house, has a cover designed for us by our publishing house Common Notions ages ago that looks kind of eerily similar to California in September 2020. And it is the ecological catastrophe currently unfolding in California that I wanted to use as the jumping off point for these, extremely brief, I was told perhaps 5 minutes, still fully serious, but also hopefully somewhat entertaining remarks today. So I imagine that most, if not all of us gathered here are aware that the El Dorado fire that raged in California over the weekend was caused by the pyrotechnics from a so-called gender reveal party. And this strange custom, the gender reveal, as we all again probably know, involves grandiosely and suspensefully disclosing information supposedly gleaned, interpreted from a sonogram of a human fetus in utero in a celebratory gathering in which pink, or in most parents' ideal scenario, sad to say, blue, balloons or cake fillings or streamers, or increasingly mushroom clouds of tinted gas are released into the atmosphere. The party format, it has been widely noted, is literally ecocidal. Its non-human body count is a mile long. In April this year, a gender reveal decimated large swathes of Florida. In 2017, in Arizona, a border patrol agent whose wife was gestating a fetus shot an explosive substance at a target, starting a wildfire that destroyed 47,000 acres. As though working for the Border Patrol wasn't already enough of an assault on the web of life, as though the Border Patrol wasn't already enough of a policing operation of the machinery of the bio-legal family, that kinship fiction that gets reified particularly intensely at the border, which portends Spiller's historicized as the always already white point of production of binary genders to the exclusion of Black and Indigenous human beings. In other words, the El Dorado fire this week was far from the first ecocatastrophe to have been caused by these pandemic, partying, gender binary fundamentalists whose cult practice has become a big trend, especially in California over the past decade. A trend, even though the inventor of the trend, a blogger called Jenna Carbonidis, has publicly recanted, expressed regret, and basically pleaded with the world to learn more about the violence of gender assignation at birth, and to stop lighting forests on fire in the name of a fetus's genitalia. The means, as you can see, have been abundant. But I actually want to suggest quite seriously, as a research question, how we might think of ecocatastrophe not as an event, but as a process, a period, or relationship, as we like to think of it out of the woods, how ecocatastrophe is inseparable from the cultural edifice that brings us the gender reveal. Sick. I always feel like adding sick after gender reveal. Basically, did gender reveals, in a sense, literally cause the fire we are ignoring? Is gender the fire turning our collective homes to ash? Surely this austere colonial hubris that leads us to naturalize dyadic sex and naturalize nature in the same gesture has had some hand in building these unlivable biomes, these conflagrations we are seeing in California today. And to link this question to my own body of work on the dialectic of kin-making against biogenetic scarcity, of families against the family, I also want to ask, how might we better apprehend gender and / as ecocatastrophe by looking at the two phenomena's roots in one same labor, sex, race, and class dividing machine, the private nuclear household, looking at their joint roots in epistemic imperialism and a certain kind of privatizing triumphalism, an impoverished way, in other words, of encountering and organizing the queer mess of nature, or natures, I should say. So I'll just close by pointing to one of the few already existing attempts at theorizing gender in this way as ecocatastrophe, rather than simply a sort of junior partner in ecocatastrophe. And that is an essay written on the subject of gender abolition and the liminal ecological zone, or ecotone, from a communization perspective by Joshua Clover and Juliana Spahr in South Atlantic Quarterly. Crucially, Spahr and Clover identified gender as a differential across which capitalist value can flow, and which is produced in order to allow value to flow across it. Gender as a differential, then, as opposed to a difference, i.e., a relation that is irredeemable for liberatory purposes. Analyzing the production of cheap natures, including via housework and ecosystem services, as well as the circulation of debt at the heart of the current conjuncture, they cast the resistance struggles to these systems of relations as inextricably interlinked. Quote, these struggles take as their horizon the abolition of both the ecological and the gender differentials, of the relations that enable capital to continue to valorize and realize itself, wherein it must proceed with the ecological annihilation named the Anthropocene. We argue that these are conjoined struggles, that the struggles against capital and against gender cannot involve a rebalancing of them, as these equilibria, even when working, are an ecocide machine, and thus that these struggles must be towards the abolition of each. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie. I think an alternative title could have just been Gender Binaries Kill. Really fantastic use of memes. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Akira.
Hi.
Great. Okay, Akira Drake Rodriguez is an assistant professor at Penn's Weitzman School of Design, Department for City and Regional Planning. Her research examines the politics of urban planning, or the ways that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces in the city to gain access to and sustain urban political power. Using an interdisciplinary and multiple method approach, her research engages scholarship in urban studies, political science, urban history, Black feminist studies, community development, urban policy, and critical geography using both qualitative and quantitative data and methods. Today, her talk is titled Critical Participatory Planning for Inclusive School Facilities in Philadelphia. Thank you, Akira.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful roundtable. Thanks so much to the panelists for this invigorating discussion that has caused me to slightly pivot my own presentation. But this project came out of some research that I was doing in public schools in Philadelphia, largely interviewing and observing parents who were doing private fundraising for schools because of the conditions of their facilities. So what sort of brought about this project was the announcement of something known as the Comprehensive School Planning Review. This is a fairly mundane process that looks at demographics across schools and in neighborhoods and the conditions of facilities to determine what changes need to be made to the facilities going forward. So this is a process that can lead to some very damaging changes to community ecosystems. The CSPR of 2013, Philadelphia officials voted to close 23 schools. These schools were closed predominantly in Black and Latinx neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So if you think of Professor Wiggin's map from earlier that kind of looks at climate change and climate change risk and vulnerability, you see that maps on pretty nicely into the majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods in Philadelphia. These green dots represent the 34 schools that were proposed for closure by outside consultants. Again, the sort of qualifications for schools remaining open or closed was largely about the potential for growth in the neighborhood, the quality of the school conditions, and the potential population within the school. This quote from Anne Ishimaru, who studies schools and educational and racial justice, conceptualizes this idea of educational justice as it relates to democratic control and processes and outcomes in schools. So the idea that school, both from a curriculum perspective, but also from a facilities perspective, should be decisions that are made with the community with an aim to achieving just outcomes. However, educational justice is dependent on spatial justice. So where we are in the city determines the forms of educational justice that we can achieve, which in some cases can be limiting, in other cases can be empowering. Thinking about the conditions of Philadelphia schools as both educational justice issues and spatial justice issues, but also environmental justice issues. And so some of these quotes from parents talk about the actual spatial constraints. This is a picture here of a school in Philadelphia where the playground is actually on top of the school because of the lack of space surrounding it, but also because of the lack of safe space. And so several of these playgrounds were placed on top of schools when gun violence was more ubiquitous in the city of Philadelphia. And so these were also alternatives as ways of addressing some of those issues of justice and public health. And so what I began doing during this process when it was announced was following a lot of existing movements within education in the city of Philadelphia, ranging from West African immigrants who were mobilizing for issues of translation and belonging as immigrants, as well as schools and coalitions for particular neighborhoods or coalitions for particular occupations or parents and caregivers in the city. And what emerged was a sort of intersectional set of movements around both things that were already existing demands from educational advocates, such as this end to toxic schools. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a multi-paper series on toxic schools in Philadelphia, bringing this attention to the public. It has served as a lightning rod of mobilization. So we saw children and educators and caregivers actually wearing face masks before COVID, because of the toxicity of these schools. And so these movements came in during the CSPR as a way of bringing about the environmental justice, as well as the labor justice. These toxic schools are not just about the health of students, but also the health of educators and parents in the community. And so bringing these issues to the forefront during the planning process is something that was really apparent as this planning process went on. Other movements that came out of this process were also the West Philadelphia Neighborhood Community Study, as well as some organizing that came out of Jackson Elementary School, where parents were working with the community and other parents to talk about what was happening in the school planning process and get more involved engagement from the community. And so that meant arranging meetings with childcare and meetings with dinner and translators and really accessible information. So we see here, this is a meeting for Jackson Elementary. We had Spanish translators. We had about 30 people show up to this meeting to learn about all of the data that was being provided during the planning process, the steps of the planning process, and where parents and caregivers and community residents could interject during the sort of public forums for the planning process. So this was in advance of any public meetings, allowing the community to gain information that was only afforded to a select few parents and educators who were selected for inclusion in the planning process. So this was a way of expanding the possibility of the planning process to take on more interest by setting external community goals and values that could be translated. There were also additional supports at the citywide level to organize across the different planning areas. The planning areas were segregated by geography in the cities. So there was a southern, a western, and a northern planning process. These groups were brought together by organizers such as the Parents United for Public Education, as well as Councilwoman Kendra Brooks, who brought together organizers to mobilize against some of the injustices that were occurring, such as the proposed closure of Shepherd School in North Philly. Finally, during one of the first public meetings, which happened the week before schools were ordered to shut down due to COVID, we saw an amazing turnout, largely of people mobilized around the conditions of school facilities. And so people were not there to weigh in on the planning process, but to support bringing the planning process back into the community sphere and into the public sphere. And so we have more protesters than attendees at the public meeting. Finally, this continues. This is a protest in front of the school district a couple weeks ago for Cassidy Elementary School, which has been promised a new building for over 2 years, only to face a proposed closure according to the CSPR. And so teachers and parents and students have been mobilizing to sort of prevent that, again, bringing together a number of movements. These coalescing and intersecting movements are predominantly women-led and receive legitimacy from outside activists / council members such as Helen Gim and Kendra Brooks in the city of Philadelphia. And so one thing that I'm taking from all of this is very similar to what we learned in the previous presentation about the connectivity of all of these movements. It's not just tackling environmental justice, but also disability justice, also economic justice and spatial justice, and thinking about how mundane and apolitical sites such as school facilities can lead to really sort of liberatory processes and outcomes. So thank you.
Akira, thank you so much.
Sure.
And we will be finishing up today with Cristina Gutierrez. There we are. Okay. Our final speaker today is Cristina V. Gutierrez, who is a teacher at Lewis Elkin Elementary in the School District of Philadelphia. Native of Dorado, Puerto Rico, Cristina V. Gutierrez migrated to the United States to pursue a college degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. After graduating with a Bachelor of Science in Hotel, Restaurant, and Tourism Administration and a minor in Anthropology and certificate in Latin American Studies, she moved to Philadelphia, where she became a certified elementary teacher, earned a master's degree in teaching English as a second language, and where she continues to reside to this day. Presently, she teaches kindergarten in a dual language program at Lewis Elkin Elementary School and serves on the steering committee of the Caucus of Working Educators, where she works organizing Philadelphia Federation of Teacher members to ensure social, racial, and immigration justice. Today, she will close off the presentation portion of our event with the talk, Organizing for Change. Thank you, Cristina. Oh, just popping back on to say that I think you are muted.
There we go. That's the words of 2020. You've muted. I just want to say good evening and say that I am honored to share this virtual space with such brilliant and strong women. And I just want to share a little bit of something that we have done and how that has changed in a school community. So I'll begin with saying that 75% of teachers in the USA are women. So, which makes the issue of asbestos, lead, and toxic conditions in Philadelphia schools a feminist issue. I am a Philadelphia public school teacher and have been for the past 19 years. During my time in the classroom, my focus was solely teaching my students the best I possibly could in hopes that I could spill over them the love of learning, and that love will carry them towards success. Now, although I still have the same desires for my students, something has changed. Last year in February, I learned from an email that the central offices were planning to perform some asbestos remediation in the boiler room of our school over the weekend, which coincided with people still being in the building during those times. Considering the track record of the school district of Philadelphia regarding building and health and safety conditions, alarm bells started ringing. My instinct was to organize in protest of the lack of communication and consideration towards teachers in the school. The work was set to begin on a Friday, the same day we got noticed. We were not informed of what type of work would be performed or the air conditions in the building when we returned on Monday. It was truly nerve-wracking. As a staff, we united and mobilized, immediately contacting parents and holding a community Zoom meeting when Zoom wasn't popular to inform parents of the situation and ask their support. They were on board. They were on our side. We exchanged messages with leaders and demanded that the proper testing be performed before entering our building. The great majority of the staff stood outside on a cold February day, all day, in solidarity. Tests were performed that night, and we returned to our classrooms the very next day. The action did not go unpunished, and to great disappointment, our union did not support our efforts. In the end, the aftermath didn't matter. We acted as a unit and took on those who silence us and choose to keep us on the sidelines, even in situations that endanger our lives. We fought together and won. Thanks to organizing, our school's environmental issues continue to be addressed. It is known that we are a united front, that we will not accept being left in the dark when our lives and those of our students are put on risk. The lesson here is we cannot let those in power disregard and endanger the lives of our people. And the way to accomplish this is through organizing. For too long, people have remained dormant, letting others steer their futures, which has unfortunately brought us here to 2020. It's time to wake up and take charge of our future. People organizing people will be the only vehicle towards the change we all deserve. And with that in mind, I just want to reiterate how a small group of people can create a big change. Because of the people who united and decided to work together, we were able to set a standard of care for our school. And this is something that could happen district-wide. And if it happens district-wide, I think as a union, as the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, we can become a catalyst of change for the community. It's bargaining for the greater good. It's taking in consideration not only wages and benefits, but also the well-being of our community. That's all I have for you.
Christina, thank you so much for ending the kind of presentation portion of our event. I will just be bringing everyone back up so that we can have a little bit of a discussion. Am I still muted? I'm sure I am. I am muted. I don't know how I am still muted.
I think you sound fine.
Oh, okay.
Or is anybody else experiencing difficulty hearing Maria?
Okay. Wonderful. I'm just going to mention to folks who are watching the live stream that I would love for you to ask questions or make comments either to specific panelists or to the group. And I think I'll be able to project them if they come through onto the screen so we can all begin. So maybe while we wait to see if we have questions from, oh my goodness, is Akira up here? Oh yes, okay. Who are we missing? Jaskiran. Okay, is that everyone? Everyone's up here. Okay, great, wonderful. All right, so maybe I will just kind of open up to the group with a question. In part, you know, I'm thinking about, especially from Akira and Christina's presentations, you know, I want to bring up the issue of public health within the context of our schools here in Philly. You know, Maris talked about retooling within the institution, turning inward. You know, Akira and Christina, you both talked about environmental concerns and kind of community ecosystems. And I want to just kind of bring up one issue that has been getting a lot of attention in Philadelphia right now, which is, you know, acknowledging that public schools in Philly are, of course, funded in large part by property taxes. And yet many huge and wealthy institutions in the city because of their nonprofit status, for example, are exempt from paying property taxes. And this is such an obvious and damaging drain on the public school system, far beyond some of the infrastructural issues that have come to light in recent years, and that you, Akira, were mentioning and Christina was mentioning. And I just wonder if, taking Maris's suggestion about kind of which way we direct and what institutional role there is in these conversations, especially at the local level, in our local communities, I'm wondering if I can pose a question to the presenters, if I can ask a question, I guess, just generally about institutional responsibility, but also if anyone wants to kind of comment a little bit about that relationship.
I can say a couple of things. It's a very sort of complicated thing with school funding, but schools have really never in the history of the United States received the support that they should have. So that's the federal, state, local level, private investors. It's really been an opt-in if your kids are there, and otherwise it's, a parent problem. But schools serve, as we see now, when so many of them are closed, they clearly serve very vital roles for broader society. And so it's definitely on, it's on sort of everyone to sort of mobilize to sort of rethink how we fund and support schools. At this point, the federal government gives virtually nothing for school facility construction. There's no guidance whatsoever on how to site or remediate a school. And so having policy that starts at the top, that gives guidance, that doesn't abandon the public school system. We haven't heard from the Department of Education. They've, tossed it to the CDC. But in terms of funding, it's very similar. The federal government has a very hands-off approach, and it's on cities and states to make up the difference. And as we see that we're entering a crisis, both financial, social, and political, where it will not be sustainable for schools to operate going forward, or childcare, critical component of our sort of community ecology.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for also bringing up, the issue of kind of childcare in the context of these institutional, the unequal kind of distribution of risk that has come, like in the wake of COVID, for example. And at GSWS, for example, Gwendolyn Beetham has been spearheading an initiative to really bring attention to the fact that, care work is, very much part of our own institutional ecosystem, to borrow from your expression, Akira. And I guess I just want to, maybe ask, if we want to imagine following Maris's presentation, how to retool ourselves. And it sounds like so much of what many of your work projects are already doing, if we can talk about those methods or those approaches, or if I can just ask anyone to comment on that particular angle.
I'm actually happy to jump in, because following up on Dr. Rodriguez, I started out my education at a public school in New Orleans that eventually became a magnet school, and then it was a charter school. And all of this happened after Hurricane Katrina. Like the school system in New Orleans just completely changed. There are currently no longer any public schools. And like, who does that impact? It impacts the people who would otherwise be in public schools. Those same, so kids who look like me. And on top of that, we have, like I said, different programs like Teach for America, Teach NOLA, that brought in a lot of younger teachers who had varying life experiences. But quite a few of the Teach for America folks that I encountered were folks from like the Northeast or the Midwest and had never encountered anybody from the South, let alone a Black child from the South, let alone a Black child in the South who is also part of a family recovering from hurricane trauma. And that process does not end immediately. It is a lifelong thing that we carry with us. And so how we navigate the educational system also has to do with what's going on in our home lives. So we can't separate what's going on in the school system from what's going on in the environmental system and the environments in which we live. Like, I am currently in New Orleans, my hometown where I was born and raised. And the first week of school, I was moving my things from Philly to New Orleans in the midst of 2 hurricanes. And this is like a reality that I had to think about, like navigating. What does it mean for me to be an actively engaged student in school and also care about my life and the life of other people around me? And the thing is, like, the folks on the Gulf Coast are not the only ones vulnerable to these kinds of storms. Like, East Coast, there's a lot more of them starting to come like that way too. So these are the kinds of things that we do need to be thinking about in our creative school system. Like we need to be creative in our schooling. And there's just like so much dysfunction at various levels that if we're not thinking about all of these things as interconnected, as if we're not thinking about how a child's life experiences are impacting them in school, how like a pandemic might be impacting someone in school, how a pandemic, a hurricane, and sitting in front of the internet for 3 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours a day, depending on what level of school you're in. And if you will have access to internet, like we didn't have power at one point, that means there's no internet. So like there's already so many different types of inequities built into the educational system that are really just being like more than highlighted. I'm trying to think of like a better word, like underscored, like bolded, and like put on billboards for us to see. And people are still choosing not to see that.
Maris, thank you so much for those comments. We do have one question, it looks like from Facebook. So I'm going to try and show it and see. And look, Roxana's face pops up. Okay. Roxana is asking, thank you all for this event, everyone. I have a question for the panel. The gender binary is a form of violence, and simultaneously there's so much to learn from Indigenous feminisms that draw on matrilineal knowledge, as well as the role of men as protectors within their Indigenous nations and communities. How can we facilitate collaboration and co-creation across diverse approaches to gender and sexuality? Is there anyone who might like to tackle that question from Roxana?
Hi, everyone. I can offer a short commentary or response to that. I think one of the things that I'm taking from this presentation is the importance of considering kind of where we draw our leadership from and our guidance from around the knowledge that we rely upon to actually build our social movements, to shape our. Hi, everyone. I think one of the things that that all of us seem to be doing in different ways is really, expanding the knowledge base and actually pushing back against a very, very specialized form of expert knowledge that has dominated the academy, and also the ways that we think about the meaning and purpose of our research and teaching. So when I think about this question of what we can learn from Indigenous knowledge systems, it's not just what can we learn from them, it's also how do we actually integrate non-Western forms of knowledge way beyond the politics of inclusion to actually have them be foundational in allowing us to adjust our aperture around questions of environmental justice, but also much broader than that, right? How we actually understand our social and political and economic condition in the moment that we're in.
I could also just tag on perhaps a very small comment, and that would be simply if to say that the question is beautifully crafted, and that is the question, and in a sense it can only be answered by making the road as we walk together. But the key, I think, as well in that spirit is to understand that there is so much about gender that we have perhaps yet to discover, so Indigenous materialisms, cosmologies, sciences, knowledges obviously need to be, sort of central in the process of, what I guess I'm perhaps a bit polemically calling gender abolition with SPA and Clover. But it's also important, I think, and I take this from Indigenous feminists like, Kim Tolbear, to understand that there's no one sort of reified, static kind of matrilineal, for example, way of doing gender that comes from, one Indigenous knowledge form. That there is a sort of cultivated foolishness about, if you like, about what gender could one day be, that we could all do with embracing, I think, particularly as feminists in a tradition in the West that has so little sort of utopian foolishness in its heritage. We think we know what women are and what they always will be. And in the history of feminism, there has been so much bioconservatism and nationalism and sort of particularly if you think about the temperance movements and eugenics, and the figure of the feminist knows everything and knows the answers. But I think there could be a kind of to answer your question about how we foster a more sort of plural diversity of tactics kind of approach to something like gender abolition. It's also understanding that we have no idea still what gender is. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
We do have another question that we can post, but were there any responses to Sophie or other responses to Jaskiran or from about Roxana's question? Okay, let me post another comment that we received from, I think, YouTube. This person asks, in your opinion, what will it take for institutions like Penn to make payments in lieu of taxes, what are also known as pilots, an extremely important topic that I know a lot of us have been thinking about. Does anyone want to jump in first?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I think that to really be a part of our city, I think that they should also contribute to the development of our students and do things for them to embrace them and move them forward. Philadelphia School District is basically minority children, the majority, and it's a disservice institutions like Penn are making to the community without not paying taxes, when those can really be helpful to clear up buildings, to make new buildings, and to offer more alternatives for our students.
Absolutely. I think it's such an important point. I know that folks who are working with Penn for Pilots, for example, alongside an organization called Jobs with Justice, have launched a campaign basically asking Penn, among other very large nonprofit institutions, to pay about, I think it's something like 40% of what would be their property taxes for an education equity fund. So there is extreme public interest in this particular issue, and as we host this event out of Penn, it seems like extremely important to acknowledge at the very least, and to kind of cull together our networks and try and advocate for that absolutely to change. Because while Penn has many different types of relationships within the community and various types of programming that are that have different approaches to working with the community, there's nothing that can replace funds that can go directly to our public school system. And so this education equity fund, from what I understand, would be directed specifically towards schools, unlike other pilot programs at other institutions that sometimes get filtered into different spaces. But I wonder if anyone else wants to comment specifically on the relationship between Penn and our city, or any other comments about pilots more generally.
I have some thoughts about that. I don't specifically know about the pilots program, but what I've just heard is sort of thinking about, like, to reframe it, what are some ways that Penn can offer reparations to the communities that it has not only displaced through like territorial expansion, like that's essentially what has happened to the West Philadelphia neighborhood. Like parts of it have been renamed, and like just like there's a lot of like historical wrongs that the University of Pennsylvania, along with most large universities and any community, have certainly enacted. And perhaps like it should also be thought of as reparations, because as Dr. Rodriguez mentioned, like the majority of the students who go to these public schools are Black children. They are children of color if they aren't Black children. So not only are you taking the space away from where those kids can live, you're also taking away space where those children can go to school, and then not adding in financial contributions to the system that funds those public schools that are no longer in that area. And like my neighbor in the neighborhood now known as Mantua, which was previously known as the Black Bottom, she was telling me about how, when back in the 70s, I thought I was going to go to one public school, but then Penn bought the building, and then I had to go find a new public school, which was way further from my house. And how do you choose to do that? And like her parents were able to like get her into a private school that was nearby, but like not everyone has access to those kinds of resources. So I'm not really sure how to make institutions have consciousness. Like I think that people in institutions feel a particular way about these kinds of practices. But really, from my perspective, like one of the resources that Penn has to offer is money. And if we're not offering like money towards the education, what would it mean to think about like offering services to folks who are from West Philly at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, access to healthcare? Like there are different types of things, or like programs that like aren't gatekept for local students to come and do programming at the university. Like Penn is policed so much that like people coming outside, like walking through campus, like are told that they can't even be in that space that previously was space where they lived and worked and learned. So like I think that also requires some creative thinking, because institutions do not care about people. It's the people in institutions who are caring about others, and then are trying to find ways to navigate within these spaces to share resources. So I guess for me, the question is like, what actions can Penn take to concretely share resources with a community from which it is taking resources actively, even if that's not how it's presented in public fora. It's like, oh, we're building new residence halls and it's going to be so great for our students, but also are we opening up who our students can be? And like as a Black student at Penn, like I have been questioned in spaces as if I should not be able to be there. And I know most certainly that I am able to be there and I should be there. But like that requires like a level of like just tuning out all the noise. And like if you're a kid growing up in West Philly and like you don't have other people encouraging you and showing you the different options that you have, like I don't understand. Yeah, it's a question of how does Penn redistribute its various different kinds of resources? It's not just money, and that's where I'm going to stop.
Maris, thank you so much. I think you kind of nailed our closing. And we are reaching time anyway. And maybe I will just make a quick plug that if you are part of the University of Pennsylvania community and you would like to learn more about what pilots are, you might consider visiting the Penn for Pilots website, which I am forgetting the website address, so you'll have to Google it. But there's lots of great information available there that helps situate this discussion. I want to thank our panelists so very much for navigating our new virtual space, and for offering such brilliant commentary and insightful perspectives. This live stream will live at this YouTube link, so you are able to share it if you think it might be interesting to other folks. And Bethany is reminding me it's pennforpilots.org, the website you might want to check out. Okay, I would like to thank our YouTube and Facebook audiences and hope to see you at future APC-GSWS events. Thank you so much.